Hi, I'm Tiffany Patlin, host of the Tiffany Talks Health and Wellness podcast, where I discuss tools, tips, and techniques to heal your mind, body, and soul. I am on a godly mission to heal the world. Hello, listeners. Thank you for joining us today. I have Cheryl Johnson with us. She is a mental health advocate with years of experience with mental health challenges, along with family members who have experienced similar challenges. She has volunteered to teach classes that educate and empower families to deal with challenges so they can lead healthy and productive lives. Thank you, Cheryl, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you bet. This is a very, very important topic, and it's very near and dear to my heart. So I just love and appreciate this type of work that you're doing. I think more and more people need to focus more on their mental health. It just makes the world a better place, because we all could benefit from it, just like our, physical health. Everybody knows that you got to eat healthy and exercise, right? But our mind really needs to be healthy as well. So if you would, please share with us how it is that you got into this, or what's your backstory, what led up to all this for you?
Probably when I was in high school, I started, realizing that, I was struggling, but that was clear back in the 70s. That was a long time ago. And, mental health was like, that wasn't even a word anybody like mental health. What's that? And so I kind of brushed it off and didn't really get, the help I need. And then I dealt with some struggles in my first marriage. Once again, not really realizing, what some of my behaviors or whatever, might indicate. And then I did foster care. And I think that was the first time I was introduced to the mental health world because the teenager that we were fostering had mental health challenges. So I was kind of introduced to it, but she had severe issues and you talk about depression or bipolar, it's like, oh, those are things where people who live in a institution, they have those kind of issues. And so we dealt with her issues and kind of moved on. And I suspected, that my ex-husband, he's had those issues, had some issues, and his mother, or not his mother, sorry, his aunt was actually institutionalized. So, we suspected maybe there were some issues there, I'm sure they contributed to the demise of our marriage. And then when we separated, that's when I really started noticing that there was just something way off. Like I was, for the 5 years prior to our separation, I was literally working 14, 16 hours a day, had 4 kids, had our own business. And I was running on probably 4 to 5 hours of sleep every single night and was like, hey, I'm 30, 35 years old and I'm at the prime of my life, man. I have more energy than you can ever imagine. I don't need sleep. I don't need to eat, I was like, this is great. Even after having 4 kids, this is wonderful. But then after I was separated and introduced to my now new husband, he's like, that's not normal. And my one daughter, my second child, she was experiencing some issues. And I remember hearing on the radio one day, oh, there's these, clinical trials. And if your child is experiencing these kind of issues, bring them in. So I brought them in and they put her on a medication, which, whoa, went really far south and did some bad things. And so I was kind of like, oh, that's not good. But I also knew that she was really struggling. I mean, at 8 years old, she indicated that she wanted to kill herself, which isn't
Oh,
normal for an 8-year-old. And she just she just get really frustrated. She was a high achiever, but like me, she didn't need a lot of sleep, and she'd be up at 3 in the morning, not just vacuuming her bedroom, but she'd get the you know carpet cleaner out and be cleaning, driving her sister crazy.
oh wow.
Yeah,
What a clean bedroom.
I know. It was great in one aspect, but most of us wanted to sleep at 3 a.m. Not even me, believe it or not, wanted to sleep at 3 a.m. Um, so that was kind of where it all started.
I'm wondering, would you be willing to share a little bit of the struggles that your daughter experienced on those medications? Because I'm wondering if our listeners might relate to that, and then maybe they can, look into this if it's something similar that maybe they're experiencing with their children.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this was back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. There still wasn't a lot of information out there on children with mental health challenges. And with her, she, besides just being obsessive and compulsive, was one of her first diagnoses, and just driven, driven, driven. She went from that to literally, I couldn't get her out of bed to go to school in the morning. I mean, literally, just, you know, and this was so not her that, we were like, okay, whatever. So for 6 weeks, she didn't go to school. And then one day I couldn't even get her out of bed, period. And so we ended up, picking her up out of bed and carrying her down to the, you know, place where they were doing clinical trials. And they're like, oh, yeah, she didn't get a placebo. She got the real thing. And her blood pressure was really low, like dangerously low. And so they immediately took her off the medication. And that's kind of where that stopped for years. But I would really caution um, parents who have children with mental health issues to be really careful. So many of these medications are made for adults, and they have what they call black box warnings on them, and can cause, suicidal ideation and different things. So if I had it to do all over again, I think I would be much more cautious than I was at the time. With her, I'm not sure I would have done things different. Eventually, we did get her on medications that stabilized her. And we laughed, she went from being this highly driven, highly motivated, just, but very, very unhappy child to
Mhm.
just happy go lucky. Her medications just made her happy. She never wanted to do anything, but she was happy. So we were like, okay, we'll take happy, you know, and she was smart enough and gifted enough in school that she didn't have to put forth a lot of effort to get good grades. So it was kind of like, there was a trade-off there, but you know
Yeah. Every parent wants their child happy, and it's so hard. It's like, what do you do? What's the right thing to do? And you're willing to just try any avenue. But I agree with you. I'm glad you touched on that, to definitely be cautious, do your due diligence, research, especially, when we're putting something in our body, let alone our children's body, just to research those black box warnings. Just make sure you're aware and that way you also have like a backup plan, right? So that way, if for any reason they experience those negative side effects, you know how to handle it. Because I imagine you didn't really have anything. Like, how did you handle it? Like, I imagine you weren't knowledgeable because you didn't know, right? You were like, what do I do?
well, thank goodness, the internet was just kind of coming, onto the public stage. And I'm just the kind of person naturally that does a lot of my own research, but I also was after, once we got her stabilized and on a good medication, it was because we had a phenomenal child psychiatrist.
Mm.
And those are really hard to come by. I mean, even today, it's really hard to find a child psychiatrist. And if you do, a lot of times you're on these extensive waiting lists. So you'll go to your regular GP and they'll give you some medications in the interim, just to kind of tide you over. But if you don't really do your own research and find out what some of those, symptoms may be from the black box warnings, and not just black box warnings, but you know, it, okay, my child wasn't doing this. Now they're taking this medication and they seem to be doing this. And it's also really hard, especially when they're teenagers, because we all know teenagers are hormonal. So, is this hormonal? Is this, a brain chemistry issue? It's so complicated.
Yeah, it is. So support is very, very important. Definitely got to have that support. So
Mhm.
again, that's why I love that you advocate, because a lot of people, even though we have the internet at our fingertips and mental health is widely known nowadays, there's still a lot of people that just simply don't have that type of support, and that's really important. What are some ways that you advocate? I know you mentioned that you volunteer to teach classes. Is that something that you actively do right now?
I haven't taught classes for a while. Um, when my kids were younger, I was so much in, I mean, my first divorce was really, really chaotic and stressful and all that kind of thing. And oddly enough, all four of my kids ended up getting diagnosed with some kind of mental health issue, in addition to me getting diagnosed with a mental health issue, all kind of at the same time. And everybody's like, how can all your kids have it and you have it? Well, yes, I have learned that you can be genetically predisposed to having mental health issues. That doesn't mean that you're going to the symptoms are going to manifest and you're going to, experience symptoms. But and this is just me talking. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert, but I have had doctors kind of agree with me. We were under so much stress that this predisposition to, having mental health issues really add that all that stress, and stress is always, always, always one of the biggest triggers, um, caused all of them to, have issues at the same time. So I had my kids in therapy. I had some of them on medication, others not on medication. We tried medication, it was just, and I was going through my own medication journey and, trying to get myself stable. So life was really, really hard. And once my kids got older and I was in a better position to deal with my own issues and my kids were stabilized and kind of out on their own, I decided, hey, um, obviously I have a lot of experience in this area firsthand, not a medical professional, but firsthand experience. So, most people who deal with mental health issues are familiar with NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I started working with them, and I really struggled. I couldn't do support groups. Those were kind of a trigger for me because everybody was so emotional. And then
Mm.
I would get really emotional, and I'm like, "Whoa, this is not a good thing." So I also am an instructional designer. That's my career, and I'm very much into education. So I took the NAMI educational route, and I would teach what we call family to family classes. They're 12-week classes where once a week I would meet with family members who had children who had mental health issues, or adult children, I should say, or loved ones. It could be your sister, your brother, whatever. And then I also taught what they call NAMI basics, was for parents of young children who had mental health issues, and just educating them on, hey, this is not a behavior issue. The behaviors are symptoms of chemical imbalances in your brain. And once people kind of, you know, it registered like, oh, okay, this isn't just my loved one behaving bizarrely, there is actually something going on. It was such a, you could just see it wash over them, this huge relief. Like, oh, okay, I can handle this. I felt so bad for so many of these parents. A lot of them would come in, especially in the, with the adult loved ones, and it would be like, my child was so highly successful. They were on their way to, being a medical doctor, or one was a professional golfer, or, all these things. And then they went off to college and just fell apart.
Hmm.
And the family members would be like, oh my gosh, they were doing so good. And it is not at all uncommon for people who are extremely gifted to also come with some challenges. So, it was, and we always started our 12-week, 6-week session with this story. And I I'm going to totally paraphrase this, but it was all about, you get on a plane and you're all excited and you think you're going to Italy, and you've got out your little travel book and you've made all these plans, and you're going to go visit all these artistic sites and all eat all this wonderful food, and you're going to go to
Mhm.
Rome and you're going to visit all these places. And then halfway through the flight, somebody comes and says, oh, you're going to Amsterdam. And you're like, I, I'm not prepared for Amsterdam. I didn't, you know, and I don't really want to go to Amsterdam. I want to go to Italy. Why am I going to Amsterdam? And, but once you get into Amsterdam, you're kind of like, oh, there's lots of pretty tulips and there's lots of things to see in Amsterdam and do in Amsterdam. It's not Italy, but, it's Amsterdam. And I think that helped people recognize that, just like when somebody dies, you mourn the loss of that person. Well, a lot of times, your child or whoever that you raised and was so successful in doing all these wonderful things and going to Italy, and all of a sudden they get, diverted over to Amsterdam. There's a mourning period. And it's hard for people to accept the fact that, things aren't going according to plan and you didn't really want to go to Amsterdam. So we help people get through the grieving process. We help them understand a lot of education about, the chemical aspects of all this in your brain, and just, how to communicate with your child who may be experiencing significant, because sometimes I always tell people, you know, and this is just generally good advice for having a conversation with your spouse or your child or anybody, but especially with somebody who has a mental health issue. They get in these arguments and they just argue and argue and argue. And I'm like, okay, why are you arguing with a drunk? Would you argue with a drunk person? Well, no, of course not, because they're so. And I'm like, it's the same thing. When somebody's
Mm.
having an episode and they're symptomatic, just think of them like a drunk person. Why would you argue with them? Wait until things calm down. Wait until, you know, they can be in a rational frame of mind, if possible, depending on the severity of their issues, and then have a conversation with them, you know?
That makes a lot of sense because they're irrational if they're not, you know,
Mm-hmm.
calm and willing to listen. That reminds me of a quote that I had heard. People are unwilling to listen to a message they're not ready to hear. I'm probably totally butchering it, but that's exactly what that reminds me of. I did want to ask you, though, how do you feel trauma plays a part in mental health?
Well, it's interesting because there is so much trauma that can cause what. I'm not a doctor. Please let me preface everything with I'm not a doctor. This is just based on my experience and dealing with a lot of people who had mental health issues. A lot of times I think people who may not have been predisposed to having a mental health issue experience trauma. And that trauma can, I believe, change the chemical makeup of their brain and cause them, just like people go off to war and they might have been, and I use quote, normal before they went over, to war. And then they come home and then they're experiencing all of these issues. Maybe some children who were born normal, you know, experience abuse growing up, and that can cause them to have issues. And I think one of this makes me also think of some of the most difficult things is getting an accurate diagnosis, because number one, for so long it was all just sit down, tell me about your symptoms, and then I'll make a diagnosis and give you some medication and move on. Well, number one, most people, if they've chosen to go to a doctor to begin with, only are going to tell the doctor what's going on today. And you only have 30 minutes, sometimes a whole hour if you have a lot of money and or insurance or something that can allow you to sit there. And you don't always go in when you're symptomatic, and you don't always, it's kind of like, oh, I had a sore throat last week. What did it feel like? Well, it wasn't really that bad. And your spouse is sitting next to you going, no, you couldn't get out of bed, you had a fever of 103. And you're like, oh yeah, I guess you're right.
It's a
you
good
know
point.
so it's I don't blame doctors, because it's really hard for them to get all the information they need. Now, I was fortunate enough, probably around 2010, 2012, in that time range, to go get a brain scan. And they actually can do brain scans now. And that really helps, people get more accurate diagnosis. But even still, you still run into, okay, now we've kind of figured it out. So if I personally have what they call complex PTSD. So I didn't go to war. I didn't experience all that trauma, but I've had extreme stress over an extended period of time and a lot of um, really challenging relationships. And so I have a slightly different PTS, PTSD, whatever you want to call it, than somebody else. Somebody else may have PTSD and it's for a totally different reason. And what medication may work for me and my situation will not work for somebody else. And they also have blood tests and things you can do now that will help you. A doctor will look at that and go, okay, we know that these kind of medications probably aren't going to work for you. It's just so challenging because a lot of people, and this is really, really important, they'll go to a doctor, they'll get a medication, and it will make them worse, a lot worse. And they're like, whoa, I'm done. I'm not doing any, that's bad.
So I
So,
imagine keeping like a diary when you start to take a new
yeah.
medication, make sure you take a diary, right? So that way you can write down everything that's
Mm-hmm.
going on, because that was a good point. In that moment, you might feel like heck, like hell. And then the day of, when you finally have your appointment, like you said, like you don't really remember because you're not in that present moment and where you're not feeling well. So I think a diary would be super helpful with that. Um,
And if
Definitely.
you as an individual don't keep a diary, I encourage loved ones and parents to keep a diary for somebody else.
That's a good point. Yes, I love that tip. Yes,
Mhm.
because there's a different perspective too. You might feel a certain way as well, but then when other people look at you, they see things differently than what you do. I ask my husband stuff a lot. That's so funny
Yeah.
because I recently
Mhm.
went to go get allergy testing, and I make sure my husband comes and I ask him, "Did I leave anything out?" Because I want to make sure, because they're the outside
Mhm.
person looking in. It's funny.
Yes.
It's very helpful. That's a very good tip.
Mhm.
I wanted to know a little bit more about the brain scan. So you did a brain scan for yourself?
Yes, I did. I did two different kinds. One was actually a, a brain scan, and it's interesting because the results, it looks like your brain is like Swiss cheese. Like you have all these holes in it. It's like, no, that's not really what my brain looks like. What that means is all those places where there's holes, a healthy brain won't have all those holes. But
Mm,
the one that has these holes that just means there's no blood flow going to that particular part of the brain. Well, obviously, if there's no blood flow, then you'll know that, if it's not going there, you could have this issue. The other one that I found really interesting for me in particular was another kind where they put all these little electrodes on your head, and then they literally turned on the calmest music and they let me look at beautiful scenery for like 30 minutes. And when they were done, they came back and they showed me my brain, and it said, okay, anywhere where there's red means your brain is just like firing like crazy, right? And despite the nice calm music and the nice scenery, like my whole front of my brain was just on fire. It was all red. So even in my most calm states, I live in this heightened, you know, I'm just like my brain's firing all the time.
so what is it meant to be? Like, how is it meant to be in comparison to that?
Most people, like said, in this particular test, my brain should be blue. Not that my brain is really blue, but in the
Right.
it, it shouldn't have all this red. And what that means is it can mean a lot of things, but in my case, what it meant was my brain, and it's true, my brain is on fire all the time. It means I'm constantly thinking. I have a hard time slowing down. One of the ways my husband tells me this manifests, and it's very true, is don't argue with me. because if you argue with me, it will take me, as depending on the, intensity of the argument, and it doesn't even have to be a angry argument, but it'll take me like a week for my brain to calm down.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so he's like, "Okay, we've learned," because he comes from a family of, they like to fight and they argue and they get over it and move on, and he was, like, having the hardest time with me because he's like, "Can't you just get over it and move on?" I'm like, "No, I can't. You don't understand." And I have to do all kinds of meditation, and I don't like to take nobody likes to take medication, but, I can take a lot of medication to help my brain slow down. I prefer not to because there's side effects and a downside. And when I was in an acute state, and I did need medication, I did have to take, Xanax and things to help my brain slow down. But now I prefer to do meditation because and that's what I tell people when people are in an acute stage, get them to an emergency room, go get help, do whatever the doctor tells you. Once you get them in a kind of a steady state and they're on medications that are helping them, then I think therapies and all these like meditation and all kinds of things are helpful. But it's like when you get in a car wreck and you're just bleeding, like crazy. You stop the bleeding. Once you stop the bleeding, then you can go in and say, okay, now let's go find out where all the damage is and what we can do to fix it all.
Yeah, I can see that. You did mention about your children that some of them were on medication and some of them weren't. Did you notice that there were certain things that they did that maybe helped them, whereas they didn't need medication?
Well, once again, I they went on medication to kind of get them into a steady state.
Mhm.
And my one daughter, to this day, she's in therapy and she's, married and got a 5-year-old and things. And she still goes to therapy. She's been through a divorce and it was, there was a huge custody battle and all this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And so, now she's in a new relationship and, she's got a stepchild and she's like, I need help. I need somebody to talk to. I need strategy. I don't know how to navigate this blended family. I don't know how to deal with all of them because she was getting like mouth sores and all kinds of she was having physical symptoms from all the stress of the custody battles and everything.
Yeah.
And so her therapist, rather than, up her medication, was just like, here, let's try these therapies, these, things. My other daughter, both my daughters have been in therapy for quite some time. Both my sons, they're kind of hit and miss.
Sometimes I think it's just a man thing. Some of them aren't,
Mhm.
too keen on the whole idea of therapy, but there shouldn't be any shame around that. I think whether it's a friend or a mentor or a therapist, psychologist, whatever it is, every single one of us needs
Yes.
support. We need support. The title of that person does not matter. We all need that. I mean, like you mentioned, your daughter, she's never experienced being in a blended family like that. So of course
Mhm.
you're going to need support. Does that have any negative connotation to it? No, it shouldn't. It's no different than a kid who's learning a new subject. They don't know, they need a teacher, they need support. So I love that you're
Yeah.
sharing how open,
Mhm.
how open you've been about that, because everybody needs support. Never be ashamed. If anybody out there is second guessing or wondering if they should get help, by all means go do that. And Cheryl's here. You're able to reach out to her via email. I'll make sure I put that up right there. You'll see her email. And I'm always available to help people out with anything because we all need help. So Cheryl, before we let you go today, do you have any last words for our listeners out there?
I think kind of what you've said, it's, and you've heard this said before, and I'm sure, if you had diabetes, would you not go to a doctor and get help and take insulin every day if you needed to? You know, why why there is so much shame associated with a chemical condition, or even sometimes it's hormonal.
Mhm.
Hormonal issues, as we all know, can make us have behavioral issues as well. So don't be ashamed. It's just a medical condition. Go talk to whatever professional that can give you the help that you need. Um, do what you need to do because life, you know, like my daughter says, she says she lived in this, what she called dysthymic state for so long. She was just mildly depressed. And she says, once I got the help that I needed, I'm happy. I can face the challenges I have. Why didn't I do this? And one very last short note is my husband will also tell you that the tool that, if you believe in God, your higher power, whatever, the tool that God gave you to help you think critically about these things and make decisions is your brain, and it's not working.
Mm.
So sometimes you need to listen to somebody else whose brain is in a better frame of mind at the moment, and listen to them and say, hey, maybe you're right. I do need to go get help.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for coming on. And thank you to all your listeners. Be sure to reach out to Cheryl. Her email's down below, and we'll have all her other contact information in the show notes. And thank you. Just thank you so much. This was amazing. And I just wish you a very good day.
Well, thank you for letting me share my story.
You bet. Have a good one. Bye, everybody. We'll see you on the next episode.
Bye-bye.